Imagine being 200,000 miles away from Earth when suddenly your spaceship explodes. That's exactly what happened to the Apollo 13 crew, 3 astronauts who nearly became the first humans lost forever in space. But their fight to survive became one of NASA's greatest rescue missions ever. When Apollo 13 lifted off on April 11, 1970, the atmosphere in America was electric. Families gathered around their TVs, kids pointed at the sky, and everyone felt a sense of pride. This was the golden age of space exploration, the era when the United States was proving it could do the impossible. For the 3 astronauts on board, it wasn't just another mission. It was history in the making. Commander Jim Lovell, a veteran astronaut, had dreamed of walking on the moon for years. He was joined by Fred Haise, who was set to make his very first trip to space, and Jack Swigert, the backup pilot who had been called in at the last minute. Together, they weren't just crewmates. They were 3 men chasing a dream that millions of people could only imagine. In those first hours after launch, everything felt perfect. The Saturn V rocket had thundered into the sky, carrying with it not only the astronauts, but also America's confidence. Inside the spacecraft, the crew joked, ran through checklists, and looked forward to making history. The moon was waiting for them, and nothing seemed like it could go wrong. For the United States, Apollo 13 was supposed to be proof that landing on the moon wasn't just a one-time miracle. It was about showing the world that America could do it again, and again, that this was only the beginning of humanity's journey into space. The Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union made every mission more than just science. It was about pride, power, and the future. But little did anyone know, just 2 days into the mission, Apollo 13 would turn from a story of exploration into one of survival. What began as a dream to walk on the moon would soon test the courage, strength, and faith of 3 men, and of an entire nation watching anxiously from Earth. 2 days into the mission, the astronauts were settling into their routine. Everything seemed calm, almost ordinary as life in space could be. They were floating in zero gravity, running checks, and talking to mission control. Then, in a split second, the dream turned into a nightmare. At 9:08 p.m. Houston time, the crew heard a loud bang. The spacecraft shuddered violently. Lights flickered. Alarms screamed through the cabin. For a moment, nobody knew what had just happened. Was it a small glitch? Or something far worse? The silence that followed was almost scarier than the noise itself. Jack Swigert, the pilot who had joined the crew at the last minute, reached for his radio. In a steady but tense voice, he said the now famous words. "Houston, we've had a problem." Those words weren't shouted, they weren't panicked, but behind them was the chilling realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Inside Mission Control, rows of engineers froze as the message came through. Screens showed falling oxygen levels. Power systems started shutting down. The truth hit like a punch: an oxygen tank had exploded, and the spacecraft was crippled. The moon landing was instantly cancelled. Now, it wasn't about making history. It was about survival. For the astronauts, the reality was terrifying. They were more than 200,000 miles away from Earth, sitting in a spacecraft that was slowly dying. The oxygen they needed to breathe, the electricity they needed for heat and power, all of it was vanishing. And as they looked at each other, they understood one thing: if they couldn't find a way home, this could be the end. The moment the explosion happened, the crew knew their ship was in trouble. But as they checked the gauges, the numbers told an even scarier story. Oxygen, the one thing they couldn't live without, was leaking into space. The needle on the tank levels dropped lower and lower, and there was no way to stop it. Imagine being hundreds of thousands of miles from home and watching your air supply literally disappear. And oxygen wasn't the only problem. Without it, the fuel cells that generated power started failing too. Lights dimmed. Heat faded. The ship grew colder with every passing hour. The systems that were supposed to keep them safe were shutting down one by one. Inside the spacecraft, the temperature dropped so low that the astronauts could see their breath in front of them. They wore extra layers just to fight off the chill. Water also became scarce. With limited power, the water purification systems couldn't run normally. The astronauts had to ration everything: food, water, even the simplest comforts. Fred Haise later admitted that he only drank about 6 ounces of water a day. Their mouths were dry, their stomachs were empty, and yet they had no choice but to endure. The stress was immense. Every crew member knew that one wrong move, one small mistake, could cost them their lives. They were exhausted, cold, and hungry, yet somehow they kept calm. Years of training had taught them that panic wouldn't help. If they wanted to make it back, they had to think clearly, even when fear was screaming in the back of their minds. For people back on Earth, the news was devastating. NASA's televised updates began reaching families across America. Parents tucked their kids into bed, wondering if those astronauts would ever return. The space program that once felt invincible now seemed fragile. Apollo 13 was no longer a mission to the moon, it had become a race against time, with 3 human lives hanging in the balance. Back in Houston, Mission Control went from routine monitoring to full-blown crisis mode. Imagine dozens of engineers, scientists, and flight directors all staring at screens as alarms lit up and oxygen levels plummeted. This wasn't just a glitch, this was life or death. And the pressure was crushing. Every decision mattered. One wrong call could mean 3 coffins drifting forever in space. Flight Director Gene Kranz, known for his calm but commanding presence, quickly took charge. He told his team something that would define the mission. Failure is not an option. Those weren't just words for motivation, they became a lifeline. With the spacecraft crippled, the only way to save the astronauts was to completely rethink how to use the systems on board. Procedures written over years now had to be rewritten in hours. Inside the control room, you could feel the weight of the moment. Engineers scribbled calculations on notepads, argued over solutions, and tested ideas in simulators. The room buzzed with intensity, but it was also fueled by determination. Nobody wanted to be the one who gave up hope. Nobody wanted to let those astronauts down. While the world saw calm updates on TV, behind the scenes, NASA was in chaos, but it was organized chaos. People who had spent their lives working on small pieces of the spacecraft now had to come together, pool their knowledge, and think faster than ever. The mission wasn't about science anymore. It was about survival, and every person in that room carried the responsibility of 3 lives. What made it even more incredible was that they were improvising in real time. Computers of that era weren't powerful like the ones we hold in our pockets today. Most of the solutions came from human minds, pencils, and raw grit. And through it all, there was one unshakable belief: somehow, someway, they were going to bring those men home. With the command module crippled and losing power fast, the astronauts had no choice but to move into the lunar module, the tiny spacecraft meant to land on the moon. It wasn't designed to be a home, and it certainly wasn't built to keep 3 men alive for days in deep space. But now, it had to become a lifeboat. The shift wasn't easy. The lunar module was cramped, far smaller than the command module, and every inch of space mattered. Imagine 3 grown men, in bulky space suits, crammed into a cabin about the size of a small car. There was no privacy, no comfort, just survival. They had to turn off every unnecessary system to conserve energy, leaving them in near darkness and freezing cold. Jim Lovell, the commander, later recalled how quickly the mission transformed. One moment they were preparing to walk on the moon, and the next they were trying to figure out how to stay alive in a tiny, fragile capsule. The lunar module wasn't built for long-term life support. Its batteries, oxygen, and water were only meant for about 2 days on the moon's surface. Now, those same supplies had to stretch across 4 days and keep 3 men alive instead of 2. NASA engineers on the ground worked around the clock to make the lifeboat strategy possible. They wrote new procedures on the fly, told the crew which switches to flip, and carefully calculated how to ration power and oxygen. Every detail mattered, even how much water each man drank or how much heat they used. It was like trying to stretch a few drops of fuel into a full tank, knowing your life depended on it. Inside that fragile lunar module, the astronauts learned to live with constant discomfort. Their breath fogged the cold air, condensation dripped from the walls, and every sound reminded them how vulnerable they were. But through it all, they kept their focus. That little craft, a machine never meant for such a purpose, became their only hope of making it back to Earth. As if the lack of oxygen and power weren't enough, another invisible enemy started creeping into the lunar module: carbon dioxide. With 3 men breathing in such a small space, the air slowly filled with the poisonous gas. The filters on board were designed for only 2 astronauts, for only a short time. Within hours, the warning lights began flashing. The astronauts weren't just running out of air to breathe, they were at risk of suffocating in their own exhaled breath. On Earth, the engineers at NASA realized the danger instantly. They could give the crew more time without power, they could ration water and food, but carbon dioxide poisoning was non-negotiable. If the levels kept rising, the astronauts would become dizzy, disoriented, and eventually slip into unconsciousness. And there was no backup system in place. The crew needed a miracle. The problem was painfully ironic. The command module had filters that could clean the air, but they were square in shape. The lunar module's filters were round. They didn't fit. The astronauts had all the tools they needed to survive, but they didn't match. It was like trying to plug a square peg into a round hole, and their lives depended on solving it. That's when NASA engineers performed one of the most creative feats in space history. Using only items the astronauts had on board, plastic bags, cardboard, socks, duct tape, they designed a makeshift adapter to connect the mismatched filters. On the ground, technicians built a prototype, tested it, then read the instructions step by step to the astronauts in space. With shaky hands in the freezing cold, the crew followed the directions and pieced it together. And unbelievably, it worked. The carbon dioxide levels began to drop, and the warning lights faded away. For the astronauts, it was more than just a technical fix, it was a breath of hope. That mailbox of tape and cardboard wasn't just a filter, it was proof that even in the darkest moment, human ingenuity could find a way. With so many systems shut down to save power, the astronauts lost many of the tools they normally relied on to steer their spacecraft. The computer guidance systems that had been carefully designed for deep space navigation were no longer available. It was like being lost in the middle of the ocean with no compass, no map, and no stars to guide you. Only, instead of the ocean, they were drifting through space, 200,000 miles from home. Normally, the command module's onboard computer would handle the precision burns, short firings of the spacecraft's engines, needed to stay on course. But with power nearly gone, Jim Lovell and his crew had to do it manually. Imagine trying to guide a speeding car without headlights, power steering, or brakes, except instead of a car, it's a spacecraft flying at 24,000 miles per hour. Lovell had to fall back on his old skills as a Navy pilot. Using nothing more than a grease pencil, a sheet of paper, and the view outside the window, he tried to align the spacecraft by sight. His target wasn't a star or a planet, it was Earth itself. He used the faint blue and white glow of his home planet as a reference point to line up the ship. One mistake, even by a fraction of a degree, could send them flying past Earth into the cold void of space forever. The maneuvers were grueling. For each burn, Lovell had to hold the spacecraft steady while Swigert timed the engine fire to the exact second, and Haise double-checked the numbers. There was no margin for error. Every time the engine ignited, the astronauts held their breath, praying they hadn't made a fatal miscalculation. And yet, somehow it worked. Against all odds, those hand-calculated, visually guided burns kept Apollo 13 on the narrow corridor back to Earth. It wasn't technology that saved them in that moment, it was skill, teamwork, and the kind of determination you can only find when survival is on the line. As the crisis unfolded, it wasn't just NASA that was holding on to hope, the whole world was watching. In living rooms across America, families sat glued to their televisions, radios buzzing with every update from Houston. Kids who once cheered for rocket launches now whispered bedtime prayers for 3 strangers floating in the void. Suddenly, Apollo 13 wasn't just a mission. It was personal. In churches, schools, and town halls, people gathered to pray for the astronauts' safe return. For many Americans, it felt like their own sons, brothers, or fathers were trapped out there. The space race had always been about competition and pride, but now it was about humanity. 3 lives suspended in silence above Earth, united millions in worry and hope. Even the United States' rival, the Soviet Union, reached out with offers of help. In the middle of the Cold War, when tensions were sky-high, that gesture said everything. Apollo 13 showed that in the face of disaster, even enemies could find common ground. The mission was no longer about politics. It was about life, courage, and survival. The media called it a drama in space. Every headline, every broadcast carried the latest update. News anchors spoke in hushed tones, as if their voices could affect the fragile thread keeping the astronauts alive. Around the globe, billions followed the story, waiting to see if humanity could outsmart disaster. For the astronauts, knowing the world was watching didn't add pressure, it gave them strength. They knew they weren't alone. Millions of hearts were beating alongside theirs, millions of eyes were fixed on the stars, waiting, hoping, and holding their breath for a miracle. After 4 agonizing days of uncertainty, Apollo 13 finally approached Earth. But the most dangerous part was still ahead: re-entry. To get home, the astronauts had to ride their fragile capsule back through Earth's atmosphere at nearly 25,000 miles per hour. If their angle was too steep, they would burn up in fiery destruction. Too shallow, and they would skip off the atmosphere like a stone across water, doomed to drift forever into the blackness of space. Everyone knew the risks. The heat shield on the command module had to withstand temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Yet engineers worried the earlier explosion might have weakened it. If it failed, the astronauts wouldn't survive. Even worse, there was no way to test it. They just had to hope and pray it held together. The astronauts strapped into their seats, wearing the weight of the moment in silence. The command module separated from the lunar module, leaving behind the tiny lifeboat that had kept them alive. As the capsule began its fiery plunge, radio contact with Houston cut out, just as expected. But this time, the silence felt unbearable. For 4 long minutes, Mission Control and the entire world waited in absolute quiet. No voices. No signals. Just static. Families clutched hands. Engineers stared at blank screens. Newscasters held their breath live on TV. In those endless minutes, it felt as though the entire planet stopped spinning. And then, a crackle. A voice. The capsule had survived the flames. Apollo 13 was alive. The room at Mission Control erupted in cheers, people wept openly, and the world exhaled as one. Against impossible odds, the 3 astronauts had made it through the most dangerous re-entry of their lives. When Apollo 13's parachutes opened and the capsule splashed down safely into the Pacific Ocean on April 17, 1970, the relief was overwhelming. The nightmare was finally over. Rescue helicopters hovered above the waves, and soon the astronauts were pulled from the capsule, tired, weak, but alive. What was supposed to be a moon landing had turned into something even greater, one of the most extraordinary survival stories in history. As Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise stepped back onto Earth, they were greeted not as failed explorers but as heroes. They hadn't reached the moon, but they had achieved something even more inspiring. They had beaten the odds, outlasted disaster, and proven the strength of human resilience. Their courage gave hope to a nation that had held its breath for nearly a week. NASA called Apollo 13 a successful failure. It failed its original mission, but it succeeded in the most important one of all, bringing its crew home alive. The lessons learned from Apollo 13 would shape space exploration for decades to come, changing the way spacecraft were designed, tested, and protected. Mistakes had been made, but solutions had been found, solutions born out of teamwork and determination. For the American people, the mission became a symbol of unity and grit. Strangers prayed together, rivals offered help, and engineers who had never met worked side by side to solve the impossible. Apollo 13 showed that when humanity faces its darkest hours, the best of us shines through. It wasn't just about space, it was about what it means to be human. Even today, the story of Apollo 13 resonates. It reminds us that failure doesn't define us, how we respond does. 3 men went to the edge of death, and because of their bravery and the brilliance of those on Earth, they returned home. It's a story of survival, of hope, and of the unshakable spirit that continues to drive us to the stars. 3 men went to the edge of death and came back as heroes. Apollo 13 wasn't just a space mission, it was a story of survival that showed the world what humanity can achieve when everything seems lost. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe, because we have more untold space stories coming your way.